My name is Paul Griffin. I'm a distinguished professor at UC Davis in California, United States. And I'm going to comment and talk today about a forthcoming article that will appear in the Sustainability magazine Peter's managing. And the title of my piece is The Conundrum of Scope 3 Emissions for Corporate Reporting. And there's just a few sort of main takeaways that I would like to summarize from this article. Takeaway number one is that the Scope 3 emissions are by far the largest source of emissions produced by corporations worldwide, by many, many fold over what's called the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And those Scope 1, 2, 3 is a designation that's been out there by the GHG protocol since 2004. So these GHG Scope 3 emissions are by far the largest. However, they are the least disclosed and the most mismeasured. So therein lies the conundrum, that we have an urgent need for firms to report their Scope 3 emissions and particularly their ability to set targets as to how those emissions are going to contribute to emissions reductions on a national or countrywide basis. So we have that need, yet there's just so many issues that come up in terms of successfully getting a disclosure program in place so that we can monitor and then manage these emissions to achieve the climate goals. So that's the conundrum, and there are a number of roadblocks, including what I believe is some questions or some faults that are with the research. There's some incentives driving emissions reporting to be produced more by outside providers, but rather than the firms themselves. And there's also issues in getting convergence internationally by standard setters worldwide to get agreement on how the reporting and disclosure should be managed and delivered to benefit investors. So that's the sort of the larger the takeaways from this. The going forward, I'd like to see more research, particularly on whether and how markets actually recognize Scope 3 emissions. Do they price it correctly? And perhaps if we're going to deliver on that and get a better idea of whether that's actually occurring, because there's some dispute in the literature as to whether that's occurring or not, we probably need some better data on those emissions, and that's what comes down to standard setters delivering promises to investors to get this information in the hands of investors in accurate and reliable information so that the pricing can occur to decide whether the required disclosures actually going to benefit relative to the disclosures and the estimates that are already in the market itself. In my article, I also actually looked at some of the actual reporting by firms themselves. And I went back over like 20 years of data, looked at the entire database of what's called the EDGAR reporting system in the United States, which includes a lot of international firms because they file into the United States as well. And the number of firms actually reporting or saying anything about Scope 3 is just a dismal number. It's a tiny number relative to the totality of all of the reports filed with the SEC. And a lot of these disclosures are actually made by international firms, which is kind of in the mining, maybe in the energy business themselves. The other thing that showed up in this analysis was that a good part of these disclosures that were made on Scope 3 emissions actually correlated quite highly with the underlying financial characteristics of the firm. And so there's an element of emissions reporting that's really just sort of replicated by financial characteristics, which leads me to believe that the more the developments in the estimation of Scope 3 emissions is more going to come from understanding industry characteristics, like the notions of the supply chain, or the notions of how value is created in the hands of consumers of products or services of the firms. On that particular point, in terms of developing measures of emissions, of Scope 3 emissions, getting to firm supply chains is actually a pretty big issue, because a supply chain involves many levels of supply. There may be the direct exporter into the United States through the shipping, but there could be many layers of supply prior to that. And getting access to that information actually is quite difficult. It's difficult largely because to get that information from another firm outside of the boundaries of your firm, the actual disclosure firm, it could be sort of a high degree of cost, particularly in the supplier firm releasing information which they could regard as proprietary and therefore damaging if it's in the hands of other people. So there's a big issue there in terms of even if we know what to do, the cost of actually extracting information is actually pretty substantial. The SEC is obviously grappling with this, and they've given firms a little bit of leeway in terms of not requiring immediate implementation, giving them some form of safe harbor as well. There's efforts being made, again, coming back to my main point of these efforts need to proceed at a faster clip than we've seen before, because while we're debating these issues and coming up with proposed and actual solutions, we all know the planet is warming, sea levels are rising, waves are crashing into Hawaii like never before. London is reaching record heat levels, and so the need for action here on the disclosure is urgent. And so I would leave that as one of my main messages in terms of getting additional headway on disclosure and measurement of Scope 3 emissions.
Paul, you mentioned the SEC, and that resulted in a rash of action on the chat. The questions amount to: is the SEC the appropriate regulator? And associated with that, what is the role of the judicial system? What will be the effects of litigation?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Peter. It's a sort of a multi-pronged effort here. We've got the agencies of the United States government, like the SEC, acting to bring about disclosure. That said, we just had a recent Supreme Court decision called West Virginia v. EPA that made it clear that not always should agencies be the defining group that would indicate what we need to do and what we don't need to do. And so they were suggesting that a lot of these decisions need to go back to Congress. Going back to Congress then moves some of these decisions and regulatory solutions into the hands of the politicians, and that raises a whole bunch of other incentive issues. And so it's a very interesting period we're in terms of maybe the sort of the political weaponization of this ESG movement. It's not just about getting better information for investors. It's about which side of the divide, the political divide, you happen to be on can determine what you support and what you don't support. I've talked before, again, I think this was in the previous conference we had, about the need for convergence of the different policy groups all over the world. That's going to take some time to bring about that convergence, if in fact you can get sufficient convergence for there to be a meaningful world at a global level. So the SEC is definitely part of it, but there's these currents out there that are suggesting that perhaps there's some other forces going on that may, I guess, distract or deny some of the power of the SEC to bring about these solutions. So let me go to another aspect of my paper, and that's essentially on some of the work that's actually being done to indicate whether emissions are priced by investors. We looked at the literature. We did a search across the different data sets in terms of what's been published and what is unpublished. And I think we came up with about 13 papers that directly in line or at least address the issue of whether emissions are priced. And particularly, there are four papers to this date, right, that indicate something about whether Scope 3 emissions are priced. Two of those papers, coming from the same university, coming from the same professors of the same business school, showed diametrically opposed conclusions. So the evidence is mixed at that level. In addition, there's some issues about researchers' use of these data sets of Scope 3 emissions, because they're using these long periods of time, all right, across a lot of firms to get a large sample. But some of the earlier data, I don't believe, was actually available at the time that the investors would have made decisions to buy and sell the securities. So, because it's backcasted to create these data sets. So that's an issue as well. Again, there are other issues which are a little bit more technical in terms of the research design, in terms of whether the regression procedures are appropriate and the number of variables are appropriate. And those issues have yet to be truly resolved. So we're still at a very early stage in understanding whether Scope 3 emissions are value relevant. But that issue is essential if the markets are to accept the fact that we need this disclosure, because disclosure is relevant to the extent needed to the extent that it's value relevant, that is, it affects the likelihood of buy-sell decisions by investors and creditors. We're not really at that point in terms of providing sufficient evidence that's persuasive to those that are largely going to be affected. The other thing to note on this is the number of associative studies versus other forms of research designs.